Well, the sentiment is clearly a lot different than it was a few weeks back. The actions taken by the European Central Bank have made a big difference in taking the downside risk scenario off the table, especially in terms of the banking system. But we've got to acknowledge there's still more work ahead of us. The European Union is doing that. They need the fiscal compact. They need to do some restructuring. And we all need to have some assurance that the sovereign debt that needs to get refinanced will get refinanced in an orderly way. And I think there's an increasing sense of commitment to get that done, and that's why the markets are reacting so much better.
And some of that optimism has flowed down to emerging markets, which have bounced back pretty well over the last 10 days. Do you think the ECB will continue to make some effort towards ensuring that this liquidity remains in the system and what has been a wavering trust gets a little more cemented?
I think the ECB is committed to making sure that liquidity is not a reason why banks are not operating to their full capacity. And I think that's a very strong statement. And it is having an impact. It's having an impact in the emerging markets because 65% of the emerging market debt is owned by European banks and 80% of the trade finance around the world is financed by the European banks. And so the European banks are important to keep the process of credit creation and that process of growth going. Not surprising to see some positive reaction in the emerging markets.
What do you expect the emerging markets could do over this year particularly, given that, of course, I think people would admit optimism, all right. We're not expecting any fireworks from the global economy, particularly from the West. What are your expectations from emerging markets this year?
My expectations are that they continue to grow. The European issue has had an overhang on the emerging markets, on the U.S., and that overhang will remain not entirely. It's gotten better, but may still remain until the issue is resolved with a little bit more certainty. But looking through all of that, I expect India to grow, I expect China to grow, I expect Brazil to grow, and that's where the growth's coming from, the emerging market consumer, the emerging market companies, and we're counting on that in the West to help us grow too.
That's so true. However, the banking sector has world over, and particularly emerging markets, also announced lots of job cuts. I mean, not just Citi, but a few others in India as well. Do you anticipate that little pain is likely to still play out fully?
As long as the country is growing, as long as the economy is growing, as long as the vibrancy is there, ultimately you need the banking system to support that growth. So I can fully understand how every bank, and at moments in time, you have to make sure you're sized right for the opportunity. But the opportunity is big over time, and it's growing, and that's a good thing.
You've been speaking to a large number of Indian corporation heads. What is the signal they're giving you? Because here in Davos, many believe that India has outperformed in conversation, but not quite walked the talk in terms of growth. Do you think there's a sentiment that's come off a bit from the India euphoria here in Davos?
I think 8% growth is nothing to apologize for. I think 7% growth is nothing to apologize for. That is fantastic. And when, as you know, when you go down to the villages in India, you go to the third, fourth level cities, there's so much entrepreneurship. The people of India are resilient, and I have a lot of faith in them. So there is no reason for me to walk away believing in anything other than the growth cycle is going to continue.
You yourself have been the big advocate of emerging market businesses. That's one of the key pieces of Citi's story in emerging market. What markets do you see will be leading within the emerging markets? Do you see Brazil doing an eclipse on India, or Indonesia, which is suddenly being the one that could take in the eye in the BRICS?
You know, every market has its own story. Every market is different. Every market is growing. The one thing I'll tell you, though, is the emerging markets are much more interrelated than people believe. The biggest change in the world is that emerging market to emerging market trade is growing significantly, exponentially. Capital flows between the emerging markets are growing exponentially. So every country may have a different model. They may be at different stages of development, but I think they grow together.
But of course, there are two aspects of banking, right? Consumers and, of course, corporations. Are consumers being more promising for the years ahead in the emerging markets right now? Because corporations have global worries, because India always wants to be the multinational company itself, right?
So I think we have to admit and know that it's about the middle class everywhere. In every emerging market, the middle class is growing. They're better educated, they have better opportunities, and that is going to drive consumption. So the consumption growth story is a real story. And these markets start with some very low levels of borrowing, credit cards or mortgages. So it is something that's going to fuel growth going forward. And corporations cannot be far behind. When the consumers need products, when they want products, the corporations are always going to be there to provide them.
You think that the U.S. recovery is something that one should watch out for from India as one that's plateauing? It's not as negative as most had anticipated, including consumer sentiment?
I think the U.S. story is a stable story, and it's a good story compared to what it could have been and was a few years back. It's come out of the crisis. We expect it to grow at about 2% this year, maybe a little bit more. The European situation has had an overhang on the U.S., but there are some structural changes that need to happen in the U.S. It'll take some time, but I'm very comfortable with the innovation and entrepreneurship in the U.S. driving that growth over time.
Being an election year as well?
I think it's an important election year. There are some significant decisions that need to get made, decisions such as sovereign debt. There is a deficit in the U.S. that has to be addressed, and this is what the election is all about. And hopefully after this election we can get some of those decisions made.
Are you worried about regulation around the world as you see it today in the banking sector? Something we'd anticipated would see more coordination during the crisis, but hasn't quite now.
I think the need for regulation, need for reform is something we've always said is the right thing that the world needs, and we've gotten a lot of that. We still have more to do, and the Financial Stability Board and the G20 are coming together and moving forward on that. But the equally important to safety and soundness is to make sure we calibrate that correctly against growth. The world does need growth and safety and soundness at this as well at the same point. And I think that's the place we're at today in the regulatory community. They're all trying to figure out how do you balance safety and soundness versus growth? Where is that calibration? How do you do it? It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm pretty confident by the end of this year we'll have a pretty good formula for that.
Citi turns 200 under Vikram Pandit. How does that feel, given what Citi's gone through, and what would the next few years look like for Vikram Pandit and Citi?
Well, it is our 200th year anniversary, 200 years of enabling progress everywhere. By the way, 109 years in India as well. Will become our 110th year this year. We started in Calcutta in the early 1900s. And we started in 1812 as a company. We started as a trade finance company, financing trade between Liverpool and New York, and we've been connecting the world literally for the last 200 years, from financing transformative projects like the Panama Canal, transatlantic cable, to the satellite, and innovating like the first ATMs or the Google Wallet today. And so I'm very excited. I'm very excited for Citi because we're completely aligned with where the growth's going to come from. And personally, I'm delighted to be able to lead Citi during our 200th anniversary.
You, as a leader, do you think you've evolved a lot coming through bad times and now being at a platform where bankers, though humble, are a little more acceptable than ever before?
Well, as long as I keep doing what the goal of Citi is, which is to serve clients and serve our customers and practice responsible finance, the role of bankers, it will be pretty clear to the society. And so I feel very good about the transformation that we've gone through. I feel very good about the prospects that are ahead of us, and I feel the opportunities for us to serve clients are still ahead of us. Best is yet to come.